Hey there Internet, the Human Floyd here, with part 2 of Roleplaying in MMOs, a Beginner's Guide. In part 1, I explained how roleplaying works and how to get involved in the RP community. In this part, I will go over the 7 biggest taboos in the roleplay world. Although I use the term sins very loosely, and only because it makes for a good title, these 7 items are generally frowned upon by most roleplayers for a good reason. As you RP more often and start to become familiar with the nuances of the art, you'll find it obvious why I've chosen these 7 sins. Even so, I will explain why each action is frowned upon, because you should always ask why. As a disclaimer, the terms I'll be using in this video are by no means concrete. There's a lot of disparity between different groups and individuals regarding the proper definition of each of these sins, so you won't always see people use them to mean the same thing. However, it's important to note that regardless of what people call these practices, no one likes them. It's also good to remember that anyone who roleplays for any length of time will eventually check off all 7 of these sins. They're easy mistakes to make, which is why most of the RP community is very understanding and patient with new players, as they learn which habits lead to more enjoyable experiences, and which habits are less helpful. The first and foremost sin is easily the most destructive. This could be considered the cardinal sin of roleplay, because it's completely contradictory to the very reason we roleplay: taking RP too seriously. Now, don't get me wrong, I take my roleplay seriously enough. I've invested a considerable amount of time, effort, and thought into my storylines and characters, and consider them a big part of my life. What I mean by too seriously is this. When roleplay is stressing you out or causing you to get angry at your fellow humans, you need to stop roleplaying. Many of the other sins on this list are things other players can do to stress you out and make RP not fun. But remember, roleplay is what you make of it. If you aren't having fun or getting stressed by a particular roleplay, you have many options. You might be able to change the story itself, find a different group of people to RP with, or maybe just take a break from it for a while and come back later. For the rest of the sins, I'm going to show you in-game examples of what they might look like. To help me are my friends Onlard Nerdness, Season Shadow, played by the roleplayer known as Malfunction, or Mal, and Lucky Scales, played by the roleplayer known as Corper. Onlard is a roleplay noob. Mal and Corper are much more experienced and have agreed OOC, remember that's out of character, to help Onlard out a bit. They're meeting up at the Tapped Vein, a tavern in a mining town. Onlard sees his fellow RPers and approaches. They say hello, and Seas asks Onlard to tell him a little bit about himself. Our Dark Elf friend then goes on to explain how he is a mercenary from Morrowind. His father was a powerful lord who wanted him to be a politician, but he ran away and learned how to fight, since he had to defend himself from bandits on the road. He's now a master swordsman. He also claims to be a master of fire magic. Onlard goes on to explain how his bloodline is blessed with mystical protection against any mind-influencing spells. He is now a wizard in the Mages Guild, as well as a member of the Fighters Guild and the Ebonheart Pact military. So, what did Onlard do wrong here? To an inexperienced RPer, that might all sound fine. Despite his somewhat cliché story, the real problem is that some might consider this to be power gaming. For gamers who don't RP, power gaming is not a bad thing. Non-RPers define it as knowing the rules of a game so well that you can make the most powerful character possible. In the MMO and tabletop role-playing scene, power gaming is often described as playing a character with so many powers and abilities that it's unrealistic, even for a fantasy or sci-fi setting. Power gamers are more focused on how badass and powerful their character is than they are on who their character really is. They sacrifice quality RP to try to be the very best that ever was.
I wanna be the very best, like no one ever was.
Onlard is a master swordsman and a master wizard, both of which take a lifetime of study. He tried to make his character special or unique by having a blessed bloodline. Being able to resist mind-influencing spells in a setting like the Elder Scrolls is a huge boon. Having maybe half of these traits would be acceptable to most people, but having so many of them makes him unrealistically powerful. But why is having a powerful character such a bad thing? Well, it's not, but unlike a single-player game, you are not the main character of the RP world. Rather than trying to have the coolest or best characters, skilled RPers try and create a person you might actually expect to see in a world like Tamriel. Power gaming is one of the 7 sins because it takes away from the believability of the roleplay and causes OOC arguments about who would win or who is stronger. To avoid power gaming, try to have a good explanation for each and every one of your character's skills or abilities. Make their strengths realistic and never assume that your character is more powerful than someone else's. After a brief OOC conversation, Mal convinces Onlard to take out the bit about being a master fire wizard. Onlard's player also decided to add that his character was learning how to fight from a young age. He puts his character in House Redoran, the most militaristic of the Dark Elf Great Houses, to lend credence to his claim of being a skilled fighter. Using the setting or lore in this way to explain how your character gained their abilities is a great way to avoid power gaming and make your character fit in with the world better. Everyone goes back into character and continues roleplaying. Season Shadow begins to explain his own origins as a guild mage, when Onlard suddenly falls on the ground, clutching his head and screaming out in pain. While this is a pretty normal thing to happen in RP, Lucky Scales and Seas have interacted with Onlard several times, and he always seems to find a way to become the center of attention. Notice how Onlard immediately drew attention to himself when Seas started talking. He goes on to scream about the pain from the Daedra who are invading his mind. While every character deserves a chance to stand in the spotlight, many people make the mistake of always trying to be the center of attention. This attention whoring can take many forms. Don't be afraid to take the center stage once in a while, but remember to let other people have the chance as well. RP is a group effort, and unlike a play, there are no main characters. Let's take a look at another example of stealing the spotlight from another game. This Guild Wars 2 RP guild, the Ebon Vanguard 1st Regiment, has just met up for a small RP event. Their commanding officer, Servato, has OOCly been planning this event for a couple of weeks now, preparing the obstacles the roleplayers will face, and so on. Her character explains to the soldiers that their enemy, the Flame Legion, is attempting a dark ritual. She says they must infiltrate the enemy hideout and disrupt this ritual. Desir suggests, however, that he could try to destroy the ritual site from here with a beam of energy, using magic he learned from his father. When Servato says that they will stick with the original plan, Desir continues to argue about it. Now, there's nothing wrong with having an argumentative or overly confident character, which can lead to interesting interactions. But when someone has gone to a lot of trouble to put an event or plot together, it's not very considerate to try and disrupt that event just to be the hero, as Desir is trying to do here. This could also be an example of power gaming, since the ability to send a beam of energy across the continent to a specific location is more than a little bit overpowered. Stealing the spotlight is a taboo because it robs other players of their chance to shine, and it's really, really annoying. It's okay to be silent for a time. Emoting your character's physical actions is fine, but your character doesn't always have to be the one talking or taking action. It's also good to remember to let other characters solve problems which arise in the story sometimes, instead of always trying to be the one to save the day. Seasoned Shadow is forced to act. He emotes casting a binding spell that will hopefully hold Onlard down and stop him from causing any more havoc. Notice how Seas emotes that he attempts to bind Onlard. By using the word attempt, Seas is allowing his fellow RPer to choose if the ward succeeds or not. This is a basic courtesy that is always expected in MMO roleplay. A good rule to remember is this: you control what happens to your character, and I control what happens to mine. Onlard, of course, is unaffected by the binding spell. He returns writing, Onlard shoots a massive fireball at Seas, knocking him into the table which shatters. By writing the result of his fireball spell, and describing Seas falling onto the table, Onlard has broken that basic courtesy. Taking complete control of another's character in this way is called god-modding, also referred to as god-moding. In this example, we'll look at Star Wars: The Old Republic. Here we have a captured smuggler, surrounded by 3 enemies. The bounty hunter restrains her, writing the emote out as Rezkak would bind the Twi'lek. She said would bind as if to say that's what Rezkak would do if there is no resistance, allowing Sydney, the smuggler, to respond however she wants. Like using the word attempt, this is a good, courteous practice. They start leading her away when Sydney suddenly writes that she breaks out of the bonds, kicks Clysor to send him flying back, grabs Rezkak's arm and points it at Kilsodom, forcing her to shoot him in the chest, kicks Rezkak away, and then runs to the elevator, all in one emote. This is obviously unrealistic, and she didn't even give the other players time to type out their responses before she ran away. God-modding is looked down upon because it takes a player's control away from their own character, and is often unrealistic. To avoid God-modding, always write any action you make on another character as an attempt. Back at the tapped vein, Seas reacts by sending Onlard an OOC message, explaining that he's God-modding, and asking him to please rephrase the emote. Oh, the patience of Argonians. Onlard tries again. Much better. The RP continues, and Onlard decides to have his character pass out from the strain of this Daedric possession. Seas approaches carefully and rouses the Dunmer, who seems to have no memory of what happened. Onlard then makes his next faux pas. He writes, "Did you do something to me, vampire?" Metagaming is when a player uses OOC knowledge to affect their IC actions. Just because you, the player, know something does not mean your character knows it as well. It's often hard to remember, but just as a writer must limit the perspectives of his characters to fit in with the setting, so must a role player. Seas is obviously concealing as much of his face and body as possible with his clothing to hide the paleness of his scales. In fact, if Onlard's player didn't have the add-on which tells him that Seas is a vampire, he wouldn't even know it himself. Here's another example of metagaming with our friends from Guild Wars 2. Desir and Slaley are sitting in the hot springs, having a pleasant conversation, when a friend of Desir's walks up. She asks, "What are you doing with that Norn? She's part of the Order of Whispers." Slaley uses brackets to indicate that she's talking out of character, and asks how this person knows that her character is in the Order of Whispers. Wayfarer replies, I looked her up on the Guild Wars 2 roleplay forums. What Wayfarer doesn't understand is that there is no way her character would have been able to get on a computer and look that up. Metagaming is a no-no because it's unrealistic and immersion breaking. It can also be used to give characters an unfair advantage over one another. To avoid metagaming, always remember what knowledge has been given to your character. Try to think of things through their mind with their perspective. Never assume your character knows something about another character unless they find out through IC interactions. Seasoned Shadow avoids the mention of his vampirism, and so Onlard goes on to discuss how the Daedra was sent by his father to possess him as a punishment for running away. Now, this isn't typically something you would hear a loyal Redoran doing, but maybe it could be justified with some explanation. Onlard doesn't bother to do so, and instead goes on to say that it is only by his connection to his god Akatosh that saves him from total domination. This is perhaps the easiest sin to commit as a role player. It's also one of the more subjective, especially in a setting like Elder Scrolls, where lore can be interpreted in different ways and everyone has their own opinion on it. Breaking lore is when your character does something that does not conform to the world they live in, something that literally could not happen due to the continuity of the setting. Some people like to play very closely to lore, finding it a useful guide for their own RP. Others care less about the lore and are more interested in creating stories without boundaries. Personally, I'm a lore guy, and you'll find that most role players are. This is because role-playing within lore is an easy way to remain part of the larger world and seamlessly interact with other characters from that same setting in an immersive way. Lore breaking is looked down upon because people play Lord of the Rings online, for example, to be part of Middle-earth. They want a genuine Lord of the Rings experience. By breaking Tolkien lore, that experience is lessened. Learn as much lore as you can and discuss anything you're not sure about OOC before you bring it into the RP. Sees whispers Onlard again, patiently telling him that the things he said don't really fit with Elder Scrolls, and giving him a link to where he can learn the lore. Taking the time to help new players learn lore is a nice thing to do, but sometimes people don't react well to being corrected. Onlard's player devolves into the angry German kid, breaking the most important sin. He follows up by committing the final sin. He has his character pull out a silver dagger, which he somehow just happened to have on him, and attempts to stab Seas. At least he attempted. I'm not thinking about the fact that he had a silver dagger on his character without any explanation, although that in itself is pretty dubious and metagamey. No, his true sin was blending. Blending is when a player allows the emotions of their character and their real emotions merge to an unhealthy degree. The blending of IC and OOC. The reason we roleplayers make such a big deal about the separation of IC and OOC, sometimes jokingly referred to as the separation of church and state, is that it's easy to become wrapped up in the emotions of your character while role-playing them. It's also easier to take out frustrations in a virtual world than a real one. When taken too far, blending is an incredibly destructive practice which leads to drama and rifts between players. No, not those rifts. Making your character outright attack someone you don't like OOC is an extreme example. Blending is usually much more subtle than that. experienced and mature RPers often find that having their favorite RP partners play enemies of their characters is especially fun. But blenders, people who blend IC and OOC, have problems being on good terms with people, because if anything goes wrong in their IC interactions, they get upset in real life. Some people will even use their emotes to make thinly veiled insults to other players. Obviously, this kind of behavior is not looked upon kindly. In roleplay, drama, betrayal, insults, personal attacks, and worse will all likely happen to your character. As long as it's all in good fun, which it usually is, there's no reason to be upset. Likewise, if someone upsets you OOC, reacting through your character is a cowardly and downright shameful way to deal with it. Blending is one of the 7 sins because it doesn't contribute to the story and often causes OOC problems between players. Always remember what your character would be thinking. Be aware of their mind versus your own. As our scene comes to a close with Onlard fleeing into the distance, his player stops to send a message to Mal. Despite his earlier outrage, Onlard's player is thankful to Malfunction for helping him out so much. There are a lot of people out there, like Malfunction and Corper, who are more than happy to answer any questions you might have about roleplay. Most experienced roleplayers are eager to pass on their knowledge and help the hobby grow. Although roleplay might seem complicated and confusing at first, especially with all these so-called sins, I'd like to point out a common theme you may have noticed which simplifies things a lot. In most of these examples, Onlard was focused more on his character than anything else. The roleplayers who really make a difference, and who end up being looked up to the most, are the ones who are less concerned about their own character and more interested in the story and community as a whole. Allow your character to be affected by the world around them as if they are part of it, and you'll find that RP becomes an enveloping experience that always takes unexpected and interesting turns. In the next and final part of this guide, we are going to talk more about those interesting turns. I will offer tips on what to do once you've entered the world and are looking to continue your character's story. Thanks for watching. Peace.